8:01 the time. Big story this morning. Theranos founder Elizabeth Holmes is set to be sentenced for defrauding investors.
Yeah, she was convicted by a jury in January for deceiving investors while running a years-long scheme at her now-defunct startup. She faces a maximum of 20 years in prison.
That's the possibility. Crop 4's Will Tran standing by live in San Jose with the latest this morning. Will?
James, Dari, I'm looking around because we expect Elizabeth Holmes to show up any moment now. She typically shows up between 8 and 9 o'clock in the morning whenever she has a court date. And today is a big moment in her life because at 10 o'clock in the morning, she will find out how much time she will spend in prison. You can see the crowd right behind me. Most of them are reporters locally, nationally, and some of them international, as this has caught the attention of the entire world, specifically Silicon Valley, because she comes from Silicon Valley. Now, the sentence, as far as what they want, James and Daria, could not be further apart. Prosecutors, they want 15 years behind prison for Elizabeth Holmes. She and her attorneys are asking for 18 months of house arrest. Now, she was convicted back in January of wire fraud after asking investors hundreds of millions of dollars to pour into her company Theranos for a blood testing technology that never delivered what it's promised. And prosecutors said she knew that and kept asking, which is why she was convicted. She faces a maximum of 20 years in prison. There is a lot on the table, guys, as far as the sentencing, because a probation officer, that particular person, recommended 9 years. The judge has a lot to consider, including lots of letters from prominent people, including Senator of New Jersey, Cory Booker. He wrote to the judge and asked for leniency for Elizabeth Holmes. Stanford professors also did the same thing, as she once attended Stanford. But that judge also has to consider deterrence, because they want to send a message to other people that if you make claims and if you don't promise, well, if you don't deliver on your promise, I should say, you can't fake it until you make it, especially when millions of dollars are at stake. So we're looking around right now. So far, we have not seen her arrive, but when she does, I'll try to interview her. Again, sentencing will be in about 2 hours from now. We have a team of reporters who will be inside when it happens. Back to you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Will.
8:04 is the time.
Theranos founder Elizabeth Holmes will learn her fate today. A sentencing hearing is scheduled for later this morning in San Jose, California. In January, she was convicted on 4 counts of investor fraud and conspiracy. The prosecution is asking for a 15-year prison sentence. Prosecutors also want Holmes to pay her fraud victims $804 million in restitution.
Rebecca Jarvis joins me live now for more on this. Rebecca, you've been covering this story since the very beginning. So what are you watching for in court today?
Well, I think there's obviously a case that's going to be made by Elizabeth Holmes' attorneys that this is a person who is a first-time offender, who deserves house arrest, who is a mom with a relatively young child at home and a new child on the way. The government is going to make the case that this is a woman who harmed a lot of people, and not just investors, costing people millions of dollars, but the patients who were misinformed, who got bad information about their health care because of Theranos tests, and then the whistleblowers like Tyler Schultz. You heard there in the piece, Tyler's parents are among the people who submitted letters on behalf of the government to say this is someone who should be behind bars. The government is pushing, by the way, for her to be behind bars for 15 years. Her team would like to see that number be 0.
Now, you referenced how Elizabeth has a young child at home. She's also now pregnant with her second child. How might that factor into all of this?
Well, it shouldn't factor into any of this. And the way that the sentencing guidelines work is that the crime that you're convicted of, she's been convicted on 4 counts of criminal fraud, is the crime that you will be sentenced for. Now, there are these other contributing factors, the fact that she is a first-time offender, as I said. But the big question here is not so much how we feel about this, but what the sentencing guidelines say. And given the size of her crime, the multiples of millions in dollars that she's been convicted of, the sentence should be something that is consequential.
But people were allowed to come forward and talk about how they feel about this when they were involved, right? We heard from Elizabeth Holmes' partner. You talked about the letter from her whistleblower in the case. Her own aunt weighed in, actually telling them not to go easy on her. So how much does a judge take into account those kinds of impact statements?
Well, they factor in, but they're not the sole factor. And you bring up her aunt, who on behalf of the government, on behalf of the prosecution, said, don't let this be a small sentence. White-collar criminals too often get a slap on the wrist. That was a surprise. It also goes to show how divisive this story has been, not just in the world, but in the home, in the family life of Elizabeth Holmes.
Now, Elizabeth has maintained this very positive, at least appearance throughout this entire thing, beginning to end. How interesting has that been to cover, and how does she go on from here?
Well, I mean, it obviously, and you've been a partner in all of this and covering it here, and we really appreciate that, spending so much time with this story. It's had so many twists and turns, and it's really been drawn out for a much longer period of time than many people would have expected. This is a company that hasn't been around for years. She was charged with criminal charges in 2018, didn't have a case, didn't have an actual suit until much later, and we didn't even have those convictions until January of this year. It's now been almost a year. The point being in all of this, it's been a long, drawn-out story. The people, the patients in particular, the whistleblowers who have trusted us with their story, who have spent time with us, what they want to see out of all of this is justice for them. This has consequences, and even though this is a criminal fraud charge about investors and money, for them it's about their life.
And you and your team at The Dropout have done such an amazing job of putting all of those pieces of this puzzle together. Rebecca Jarvis, we appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Welcome back to Yahoo Finance Live. We are keeping a close watch on one of the most high-profile white-collar criminal trials in history this morning. Elizabeth Holmes, the founder and CEO of the now-defunct blood testing startup Theranos, is set to be sentenced today for fraud convictions that a Silicon Valley jury handed down back in January. Holmes now faces up to 20 years in prison. Yahoo Finance's Alexis Keenan is live for us in San Jose from the federal district court there. When do we expect that to come down?
Well, Akiko, this trial has been anything but short, and that could be anticipated today, too. Now, we could learn as soon as a few hours, 2-3 hours from now, the fate of Elizabeth Holmes. She is set to appear here in the San Jose courthouse, where a jury in January handed down 4 guilty verdicts on criminal fraud. She's facing 20 years in prison, as you said, on each of those charges. Now, technically, each of those charges carries 20 years. That would be 80 years, but all of the criminal legal experts that I have spoken with have said that she should not face anything near that. Now, she started Theranos in 2003, and she worked for about 15 years to try to make her blood testing company offer miniaturized blood tests. However, the jury found that she fleeced investors out of hundreds of millions of dollars by lying to them about the capability of her blood tests. She is also looking at fines as well as prison time, although the judge has broad leniency in deciding what her sentence will be. He doesn't necessarily have to send her to prison at all. Now, let's take a look at what Holmes is asking for versus what prosecutors are wanting to be her sentence. Holmes is looking for an 18-month house arrest. That's what her attorneys are asking for. On the other hand, government attorneys, they're asking for 15 years behind bars plus 3 years of supervised release. Also asking for about $804 million in restitution, and that would be to repay the funds that they say she owes to her investors. Some of those investors, wealthy individuals, others, corporations like Walgreens, which Theranos did a deal with back in 2014. Now, also what will come into play is the recommendation of the probation officer. The probation officer has issued a report to the court saying that they recommend 9 years behind bars. But Akiko, these are really daunting charges. They are serious charges, and we will be watching from inside the courtroom, and we'll bring you the latest as soon as we have it.
Alexis, really quickly, you know, Elizabeth Holmes certainly not the first one in Silicon Valley to be accused of fraud here, but I know a lot of people are watching this to see what this means for potentially other cases. What are the implications, you think?
Yeah, you know, this case certainly has broader implications for Silicon Valley and founders at large. Look, just this past week or so, we've been looking at possible misdoings, misappropriated funds with the FTX scandal. Not to say that's a Silicon Valley case, but indeed founders who are starting companies and wanting to prop up and hype their innovations, this is absolutely going to be an indictment for how far that hyping can go in order to really sell those products and services. Some of the past cases that would be similar to Holmes in terms of financial fraud, those average around 16 years behind bars that those defendants have seen. So these are just very serious charges, but certainly they will be a predictor perhaps of what's to come for founders in the future.
Okay, look forward to your coverage throughout the day. Alexis Keenan outside the courthouse in San Jose. Thanks so much.